Thank you so much. I could not be more appreciative of the warm introduction and you setting the stage for how this conversation will go today. I'll just make a few additions to those wonderful ground rules, and that is that this conversation is only going to be as good as you all feel comfortable participating. And so I welcome your participation in multiple ways. Unmute yourself, be rude, interrupt me, let me know. I can't see every face and don't have the luxury of being able to respond to those. All of that communication that happens below the surface, that's not just what we say. So I encourage you to use your reactions, use the chat, or unmute yourself to let me know if you would like for me to spend more time on anything. But in the interest of our time today, I just want to let you know we're not here to have any particular challenging conversation today. Rather, we're here to consider some framework, some guideposts, if you will, for how we have respectful conversations on race, social justice, and challenging topics and conversations. And because it's such a big topic, and because there's so much that I can say, as evidenced by me being encouraged to thin out some of the slides that I'm going to share with you all today, I have prepared several documents to help you extend this conversation and make it applicable to your own context. You'll notice that this QR code takes you here, where you can find every slide that I prepared in preparation for our conversation today. We won't actually display all of them on today. A resource guide as well that's been created that has links to every resource that I use to create today's conversation. Those all go into much more depth than I'm going to have time today. So I'll try to make reference when I have redacted something or when you can find more information in those resources. But just to get us started, to get us primed before I lose you all, I want to start with the question. What are some challenging topics that come up in conversations? So think of a time when there's been a need to have a tough conversation. And what are some of the examples that you can think of? You can tell me in the chat, you can unmute yourself, either way. If you use the chat, type the word stack, and I'd be happy to acknowledge you and then allow you to unmute and discuss whatever that example is. Photo registration and rights. Paul, do you want to say anything else about that?
Well, I would just say we sit in a state where this has become an issue, and in the primaries, some people were concerned or perhaps even thought they were losing their vote because of changes to the law. So, an issue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we can infer from your response that there are some stakes there, right? Some challenging conversations usually are conversations where there's either the perception or the reality that you stand to gain or lose something, right? By how I participate in this conversation, how effective I can be in this conversation. I see Amanda share mental health challenges. Students feel very comfortable sharing with you. I think that's we might agree that that's been a cultural shift where people are more willing to have these conversations, and yet that doesn't make them any less sensitive, right? There's less stigma, but there's still a need for us to be aware of the ways in which different conversations, examples, references might land on folks, depending on whatever their positionality is. I enjoy them, but don't know how to handle them sometimes. So I'm hopeful that today's conversation gives you a few resources, some things to think about. So in the interest of time, we'll move forward. There's going to be plenty other examples, some that came to mind when I thought about preparing for this. That came to mind as part of my own lived experience and kind of missing from the environments that I was in when these things arose. An opportunity, or so how often have you all showed back up to your campus after something like this has happened, right? And you can feel the silence. It's palpable, right? And depending on what your positionality is, that silence or willingness to engage on certain topics over others, or just that trepidation that you have just showing up and knowing that you might have to engage on topics like this can be really challenging. And even when race isn't obviously apparent, there are often situations or circumstances happening in the world that will land on someone differently depending on their lived experience or their perspective, right? The implications can be different depending on whatever your positionality is. So I've given a few in these visual representations here. Again, we're not here to have any particular challenging conversation, but are there others? Well, you all already gave me some examples of others. This slide is purposefully blank, because this slide is perfect. It's there to represent what typically happens when these things occur, right? They're well-meaning leaders who have only taken the step of empathy such that they don't want to harm anyone, right? That they don't want to take any risk, that they recognize or they are aware, they're self-aware that I lack the skills to have these tough conversations. And because I'm aware that I lack the skills to have these tough conversations, or I am afraid of saying the wrong thing and further alienating my team, what happens is that I don't say anything. And so the question that I'll pose to you all is what happens when no one says anything? What's the impact on the environment when there's a need or an opportunity to have a challenging conversation, but no one's having it? Right. So I see nods of acknowledgement. In the interest of time, I'll take that to mean, and I'll elaborate to mean that you can voluntarily or involuntarily, nothing gets done. Thank you. You can voluntarily or involuntarily exclude yourself from that environment. Right. That environment is now sans one brilliant person's contributions and the opportunity for them to be able to influence whatever challenge it is that you have so assembled yourselves, right? Because I'm not feeling seen, I'm not feeling heard, I'm not being given the opportunity to discuss something that had a real impact on me. So why do we hold these conversations? Well, as mentioned before, in discussing those resources, one of the things that's linked is a PowerPoint to the summation of a book called Critical Conversations. And that book is evidence-based, is based on research of 20 years and 100 people. And what they found through that research is that the key to being an effective leader, a teammate, or a parent is one's capacity to skillfully address emotionally and politically risky issues, right? Because again, the risk is that I lose folks to lead. If there's no one to lead and folks don't feel connected to me, they don't feel seen, they don't feel like something that's a big part of themselves, which usually has some connection to why a conversation might be crucial or needed or necessary, right? Now I don't trust you, so there's no one to lead. So the ability to be able to have these conversations is extremely important. And what I want to do before I move from this slide is just point out that in my experience, what I found is that what helps at work helps at home, right? And that those things that I have adopted to become a better communicator, a better leader, a better administrator have made me a better father, have made me a better partner, have made me a better spouse. These things are inextricably linked. And if I'm genuinely trying to find this consensus, this opportunity to band with people to solve tough problems, then I become a better person all around. The skill set is worth us learning about. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Mississippi, where I got all of my degrees so far, I remember, first of all, my parents weren't all that excited about me choosing the University of Mississippi. My whole family went to Alcorn State University, graduates of Alcorn State. My grandfather ended up being the president of Alcorn State University. So, but I didn't understand. They were kind enough to not make it explicit for me, right? The issues that they had with my choice, and they recognized the economic realities that drew me there, some personal realities that drew me there as well. One of the things that I remember is that I came affiliated with the institution through this program called the MOST Conference. It was an amazing experience. Hundreds of talented African-American students from the state of Mississippi brought up to campus, get an opportunity to see what it would be like to be a student at the campus. I made a decision at that conference that I was going to attend. And then for the first few weeks, they talk about your first game and how mind-blowing it's going to be, what the experience is going to be like. And I remember showing up to the Grove so conscious that I was different because I had on a t-shirt and jeans, those things that I was used to wearing at other games when I was a kid growing up, going to HBCU games. I was used to the band being the main draw. This was my first PWI game experience. And one of the experiences that crystallized for me was being on the front row of the student section as the band plays what I recognize as Dixie. And at the end of it, thousands of people behind me screaming, "The South will rise." And everybody around me is hyped, super excited. But I am the grandson of a sharecropper from the Mississippi Delta. What South? What does the South rising again mean? And as somebody who knew I had aspirations, right, to challenge tough problems alongside people and recognizing that I wanted to contribute to the educational enterprise at the highest level one day, and that was going to require of me to have conversations like, how is it that you engage with this institution so differently than me, and then still expect for us to be able to have this shared experience? recognizing that conversations like that would be essential to where God is going to take me in my life, I needed an opportunity. I needed a skill set, right, to be able to have these tough conversations. In other words, I needed to ask myself questions like, who am I, right? What the answer is something that's deeply informed by self-exploration and should be hard to shape for outside sources. So what's the perspective from which I'm entering into this conversation, from which I'm experiencing others and their ideas and their perspectives in the conversation? What are my core beliefs and my goals in this conversation? I think that's such an important starting point. And one of the things that informs that starting point is having an understanding for what it means to have a pool of shared meaning. What do I mean by that? I mean that I did not share with those thousands of folks who were participating in this game day experience in this particular way, a pool of shared meaning. We were all students at the University of Mississippi, and in that way, our stories were intertwined and overlapped, right? But there were also ways in which my story was unique to my own experience, right? So a pool of shared meaning, it means that each of us enters into a conversation with our own opinions, our feelings, our theories, our experiences about a topic, right? About inferences that we make. And so I acknowledge that my inferences, my positionality is an N of one that comes with its own nuances informed by a very unique set of experiences. Again, there are people with whom I share those experiences. There are also folks with whom I don't. And kind of taking that point further, their perspectives, the way that they show up in these conversations is informed by a very unique experience, some of which I know things about, some of which I don't. So how does this pool of shared meaning both motivate and enable people to make better choices? Well, it's a birthplace of synergy. As people are exposed to more accurate, more complete pictures of the people that they are solving problems with and the problems that they are solving, they make better choices. And not only does it help us make better choices, but since it's shared, people willingly act on whatever decisions they make with unity and conviction. This is why we should understand and appreciate this pool of shared meaning. But in order to do so, we've got to master our own stories, right? So that experience was one that I reference now as an educator, as something that reminds me whenever we are participating in this educational opportunities, these environments together, and we lose sight of why we are all here, right? Mastering my story and remembering those things that pull me toward a career in education, those tough experiences, whatever they were, those challenging experiences, it pulls me back, it pulls my focus back to the students and why it's so important for me to make sure that I stay in these dialogues, even when there's a potential for me to become angry, scared, or hurt. So I offer all of that as a scaffolding for our conversation today. I like the image of scaffolding because it's something that we construct temporarily in order to build something permanent. And every structure doesn't have to have the same type of scaffolding. It doesn't have to work for every situation. And just because scaffolding is temporary, it doesn't mean that there aren't contingencies and fail safes that we build into it, right? So I'm going to offer lots of different frameworks for us to think about, lots of different possibilities as we move forward today for you to think about. First and foremost, having a shared purpose. So as I thought about the group that I would be in front of today, I know all of you all are part of educational institutions. And if I try to go 50,000 feet up, 40,000 feet up and think of what is the mission of education, what is it that most of the people who might be assembled here today believe about education? I think is that education is a powerful tool to improve one's life, that society operates better when people who comprise it have educational opportunities available to them, and that life requires people to know how to do certain things. I have this image here of something that I don't know how to do, and I'm grateful that there are educational opportunities that help people know what to do in this particular respect. In other words, our institution's missions are usually some attempt to reconcile these sometimes competing interests of discovery, of engagement, of teaching, and the overlaps in between, how those things integrate. And so I offer that as a foundation for our importance for why we want to have some things to reference in these tough conversations. In addition to asking, who am I? What are the assumptions that I have? How I show up. I think it's also important for us to remember what our purpose is. Why are we here? And asking some follow-up questions of, can we assume a shared mission? Can I be successful? Is what I want to gain out of this conversation achievable even, right? And what do I really want to gain from this exchange? But there's a problem. And that problem is that we don't always have situations where there's a shared purpose. So what do we do in those situations where we don't start out with a shared purpose? Well, the first thing we've got to do is frame the conversation. And I think the National Equity Project offers some really cool recommendations about how we frame this conversation and why we should frame this conversation. So what's an example of that? First, defining what might a community agreement mean? What might be some things that we agree to as a community that we need in order to participate well in these tough conversations? It simply means a consensus on what every person in this group needs from each other and what we can commit to each other in order to feel safe, supported, open, and productive and trusting, with the goal being that we can do our best work and achieve a common vision. Agreements are not rules though, and they're not norms. So whereas agreements, and there's a slide that breaks this down for you in the expanded version, where agreements are aspirations or a collective vision for how we want to be in relationship with each other, rules are mandated and enforced by authority, and they don't necessarily reflect the will or buy-in of the group. Norms are the ways in which we behave that are currently we're in relationship with each other. And it's important for us to know the differences between the two, but also how the three, but also kind of focus, because it brings our focus to the importance of agreement, that mutual buy-in, these things that we arrive at or can arrive at together. They matter because we can't achieve our vision in a hostile, disrespectful, or undermining group culture. For those faces that I can see, I see some nods already, right? In a culture that it's difficult to achieve a shared mission. I see plenty of agreement. I won't ask you all to unmute yourselves. You're doing it with your faces. Thank you. And some of the most critical conversations that teams need to have are emotional, are painful, are challenging. How many people can agree with the fact that change is challenging? Right? And that the structural, right, the where we're at, the structures that dictate, the systems and structures that we're trying to operate sometimes dictate that we're nimble. We're going to have to be adjustable to those realities, right? I had just left the University of Mississippi where I was an administrator in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Have you seen what happened in Florida? Have you seen what happened in Alabama? Right? Have you seen what's on the horizon in Mississippi? Right? So we have to be nimble, and sometimes those conversations can be really, really challenging, scary, painful. Staff relationships model how students kind of what those relationships should be, right? So if we aren't modeling them well, then how can we take these skills into the classroom, right? So that's why I'm focusing a lot of our attention on how we can prepare ourselves and prepare the environment for having these tough conversations. It's also a key to sustainability and the challenging jobs of education. How many people have had experience with the ways in which that turnover, when folks can't or don't see themselves as comfortable, how it can cut the legs from under our progress in service to our missions. So it is important to distinguish, though. I mentioned, rules are not agreements, are not norms, but there are a couple of different types of rules and of agreements. One type is operational, and this just decides how you'll decide. Are we going to command where decisions are made without involving others? Are we going to consult where the group is gathered together? Are we going to vote? Are we going to reach consensus? How are we going to do that? That's an operational agreement. But then you also have relational agreements where you decide how you'll challenge ideas, right? So in this group, we're going to challenge the idea, not the person, right? We're going to look inward, right? If you feel challenged in the conversation, we're going to start with self-exploration, right? We're going to show mutual respect in our conversations, right? Maintain the respect for self and others. We're going to understand that stories matter, that people inherently bring some value to this conversation, and that we have an opportunity to learn and grow from each other, and that we should protect it at all costs. The National Equity Project also offers this recommendation, that you engage everyone in the process of setting these community agreements. What does it look like? Well, we might start with thinking. What do you need from every person in this group so that we can serve our students well, do our best work, and achieve our common vision, right? Let's collaborate. So you might think for a minute, give people time to think, and then put them in groups, right? And ask those groups to agree on their 1 to 3 out of the list that they produced on their own, right? And you'll likely need to model it, kind of show them where you're going. And you don't have to be married to this process. It's just a suggestion. Each pair or trio shares their top agreement with a larger group and explains why it's important to them. The large group asks clarifying questions and then discusses. Then you can refine Test for consistency with thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways, 1, 2, 3, rank these. Put a star by the ones that mean the most to you. If there's no consistency, you can set us aside and repeat the process for each pair or trio. And then we adopt them. So the revised list is brought back to the group in another meeting. And we say, yeah, we can agree. This is how we're going to reach these agreements. Here, the following slides are some examples of resources that you can use, that you can revisit when you're wanting to develop these. One comes from the Center for Courage and Renewal. I'm sorry, the following slides are examples of groups or organizations that have engaged in that process to produce agreements. I'm not going to go through every agreement. The slides that are available to you have all of the ones available from this resource, but not all of them that are potentially available to you on the internet. So an example being giving and receiving welcome. And I invite you all, as we do this, if you do have the full expanded version up, or as these that are popping up on the screen resonate with you, please put stack in the chat. I would love, after I go through the few that I've highlighted, to hear from you the ones that resonate the most from you, the ones that you find most important and relevant to your context. But giving and receiving welcome, understanding that people learn best in hospitable spaces, and that we support each other's learning and giving by giving and receiving hospitality, or speaking your truth in ways that respect other people's truth. So recognizing that, I've got that N of one. My views may differ, but speaking one's truth in a circle of trust doesn't mean interpreting. What you can infer from this is that this group recommends that if you're going to have these conversations, and if you can compare for them, it's important to arrange yourself in a way where there's no hierarchy. So you'll see a mention of a circle several times throughout this. Oh, and that also brings up something that I should not have forgotten to mention, that none of these types of processes should be heavily academic, that these have roots in indigenous practices, right? These are just things that work in community, and they will be inherently different for the different communities that you might find yourselves in. So it's important for you to kind of approach it being very context specific and aware of that context. So again, as I go through these and you see the expanded version, if there are some that resonate with you, let me know. I'm going to go through just a few more. Know that it's possible. Enter into the conversation with hope. Have a vision for what could be. Know that it's possible for us to be able to change and grow from a conversation, and that the seeds that are planted here can keep growing. So this conversation might not go well, but it might be the reason that somebody thinks about something differently, right? It might be the reason that somebody reads something different or prepares themselves differently for the next challenging conversation. Observe deep confidentiality. What I usually do is go through these community agreements at the beginning of a conversation like this, and I give people explicit permission. Hey, you can tell people what I share with you. I've purposefully picked the things that I've put into the presentation today in hopes that you take those things out, but I'm the only person giving you explicit permission to do that. Other people may give something in this conversation because they trust this circle and they're doing it to contribute to the learning environment, but they're not giving you permission, and you don't have the perspective to tell their story somewhere else, right? So that one's important to me. And then finally, this is the biggest one for me, right? No fixing, no saving, no advising, no correcting each other. It may not be for the purpose of the group that you're thinking about when you thought about having these tough conversations. You may be in a context where that is very important for you to challenge, for you to correct, or for you to at least state what it is that's your belief. But this one is one that I would love for you to consider when you're going into these tough conversations, because oftentimes there isn't a right or wrong, but there's an informed perspective that could shift if you are introduced to mine, and if we have a relationship that extends beyond our innate need to try to be right or wrong in conversations. So are there some that resonated with you as I went through those, or some that you see in the expanded version that really spoke to you? See nods, to see people agreed. Some of them, or some that you might have found challenging, some that you disagree with.
I'll chime in. I'll say the one that you have on the screen right now is probably the biggest issue or challenge for me. Because I think if you are a strategist or have a problem-solving mind, your goal is always to fix the problem, even if it's not yours to fix. So just creating space for people to have a soft place to land is what I've been trying to get to, versus having to solve their issues.
Listen, that you are speaking to somebody whose top 5 strengths, 4 of them are in the strategic category.
Yeah.
right? So I'm so oriented to fixing problems, right? But people are not problems,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So much of what requires us to have these tough conversations is people being considered problems. The boy asked us to think about what's it feel like to be a problem, right? And I know that it's really, really tough to show empathy across these differences when somebody's idea might literally make me, right, make my access to resources less, right? Somebody's perspective of what they offer might literally, the extension of it, if I'm a strategist, if I think about how dominoes fall, might literally be death for people who look like me, maybe, right? And so now I'm asked to just hear that, and I'm asked to not try to fix that. The question becomes, how can I be effective, right? What is it? How can I plant seeds in this conversation and recognize that it's just seeds? This might not be the pruning conversation. This might not be the fertilizing conversation. This might just be the planting conversation. Or this might be ground that already has salt in it that I don't need to be planting my seeds in anyway. Right. So I appreciate that acknowledgement. I see some things in the chat, some activity here. Let's see. Circle of trust and safe spaces, transparency is important. Having a safe, yes, I absolutely agree. Those places are sometimes hard to find and feel, but we can build them. We can build them within our scope of influence. If I'm talking to leaders, right? If I'm talking to folks who are going to be entrusted to lead leaders, then we can build them by being committed to what it is that we want to gain out of these conversations. So those agreements bring us to this question. What is my role here? What influence can I or should I have in this environment? And as I think about that, I've got a core responsibility. If I want to achieve these goals with folks, to make it safe. Now, again, I know that that's coming from the dude who was in DEI at the University of Mississippi, and that's a very specific context in which I needed to gain consensus from folks who might not have been aware of whatever perspective I was bringing, or who might have a very different one. But I'm confident that even though my perspective was built in that crucible, that it's also applicable to other contexts in which we find ourselves in, particularly those contexts in which there are going to be challenging conversations. So in other words, what can I do to preempt this being a challenging conversation for someone to enter into, especially if I had decided that it is a conversation necessary in order for us to move forward to create a more equitable world for those that we have said that we're here to support. And there are two conditions of safety that we can assume. One is mutual purpose. And I've talked to us about how we can try to establish a mutual purpose. Another is mutual respect. So having respect for the other perspective. Now, am I saying that we should have to have every conversation? No. Right. But what I'm saying is that we should respect those in whom we're engaging willingly in conversation enough to appreciate that they bring a unique and valuable perspective. So do others believe that I care about their goals in this conversation? Do they trust my motives? Do they believe and am I modeling that I respect them? All right. So it brings us to a path for action. There's an expanded version of this that tells you what I mean by this, but it's important to see and hear. Right. First, I start with seeing and hearing what someone is telling me, what their context is, what are their goals, what are they possibly trying to achieve out of the conversations. I see a reference to Yellowstone. I have to come back to it and see what that would give some more context there. Telling a story. And realizing that it is my story informed by my lived experience. Right. I'm feeling right where I am, how my lived experience has shown up, where my triggers are, and all those things. And it's only through doing those things that I then act and determine what I'm going to say, how I'm going to engage, what I'm going to process out of what just occurred. It's also important, though, for us to refuse the fool's choice. And so what is the fool? Oh, absolutely. I'll share that in the chat. Next time I hope I remember next time that I am asking you all for feedback in the presentation. I'll go to that and make sure that I don't distract myself. We've got to refuse the fool's choice. What is the fool's choice? It's in thinking that that speaking up will hurt the relationship or the feelings of the people involved, and keeping silent and never expressing the issue that needs to be expressed. How many people have chosen the fool's choice? In other words, went home, taking your ball home. I was silent in spaces when I had an opportunity to contribute. Right. I didn't contribute because I felt like showing up and saying what I needed to say was going to hurt feelings. Right. Now, Sometimes that's because of the way I show up and my positionality makes me particularly sensitive to a conversation. Sometimes it's because the environment hasn't been conditioned for that type of continuous improvement or critical feedback, right? Either way, though, this can be a reason why I'm not participating in it. And I do believe that it is a fool's choice because I think there are other questions that we can ask, right? I think I can ask questions like, what do I really want for me? For the other people who are here, for the relationship. How would I behave if I really wanted that? Those questions are in a slide that's been redacted for the conversation, the time that we have today. But also asking questions like, what do I not want? How do I go about getting what I really want and avoiding what I don't want? These are ways that we can avoid that foolish choice. But even in our attempt to try to avoid, right, we're going to go the wrong way sometime. And I wanted us to discuss for what happens. How do we know we might be headed the wrong way? People usually, when they're in a crucial conversation that they haven't prepared themselves for, or that even if you have prepared yourself for, you choose two different things, right? In that fool's choice, you choose silence or violence. So you all type in the chat, which one resonates the most with you? Is it silence or violence? Usually mine is silence until it's violence, right? And what do I mean by that? I might resort to sarcasm. I might sugarcoat. I might couch things. I might beat around the bush. I might avoid or I might withdraw. But then if I do show up, right, and I haven't felt heard in a while, then I might start taking up too much space. I can't give you the floor back because you don't understand me yet, right? I might start labeling what it is that you believe as something that I think you might want to avoid. And so I try to change your opinion by labeling your current opinion as something that I know you wouldn't want to be, right? Or attacking. You start challenging the character because now I've labeled what it is that you said. Now I've made you racist or sexist or whatever. I made the person, not what you said, but the person itself. So I start to attack the person, right? So it's important to know which style we usually resort to. So when that happens, what can we do to rebuild safety? First of all, ask the question, what role can an apology play in restoring safety? Am I sorry? Was it something that is there a way for me to genuinely apologize for the way that I've affected this conversation? Is there a need? Is that something that I need from the other person in order for me to continue in the conversation? How could I also contrast what it was that I intended? So when people misunderstand my purpose or respect, how can contrasting help? Remember, this is not challenging. This is not being so offended that they have asked for an apology for you or asked you to acknowledge what it is that was challenging in that conversation. So much so that now they have to apologize to you. This is just making clear what it was that you intended, while also genuinely being conscious of the impact that you had in the conversation. So I do appreciate that you're saying this, right? But I think there's room for me to also believe this, right? I do appreciate that my impact on you was this, but my hope when I shared these things was that we be able to have a discussion about X, right? So a way of rethinking about it. Remember, agreeing when you agree. So start with an area of agreement. If there's an opportunity for you to find a way to start with what you agree, do that. If you agree with what's been said, but information is incomplete, build, right? Point out the areas of agreement and then add the elements that have been left out. When you don't agree, rather than suggesting that someone's wrong, compare your two views, right? Or tell them about the implication of those views, right? What's also available to you in your expanded version of materials is a list of some things that you can do when things go left, right? So I gave you all these ideas, these hypotheticals, these things we can think about, these things we can consider, these things that we can try to build in consensus with other people to try to make sure that we aren't having the negative implications of crucial and challenging conversations, right? But somebody's gonna say something stupid, and it might be me, right? So what happens when that happens? How many of you all have a mom who can look at you and tell you to sit down from 500 feet away, right? Or tell you to shut up with her eyes, right? We can still do it. We can still do it. And somebody says something that's just completely off base. Now think about this. Now it may be an alienating experience for the person, but if they've already, right, done something to contribute or challenge the type of environment that you're there, you may have to just give them a silence there, right? You may have to be direct. When you said this, I felt this, right? Name the behavior, state how you want the person to respond, say how you felt about that behavior. Remember, when you did this, I felt this, not you said this, so it makes you this kind of person, right? Or humor. It's not appropriate every time. It should never be done at the expense of the person who's been harmed or marginalized, right? But it could be a tool to diffuse. Now, this is an incomplete list. I admitted that. I hid some of the slides for you in interest of time. Looks like I did a good job in doing so because about 4 minutes ago, I got a 5-minute warning. But I could not be more appreciative of you all's time and your attention today. I won't be made a liar. I remember that I owe you all a link, and while I'm going to grab it, I invite you all to queue up questions that you have. Let's keep the conversation going. One of the things that I forgot to include that I want to be sure that I give to you all, and I'll give it to you all in the chat now, is a way to get in touch with me. And so I am at ejetney@gmail.com. I've just placed that into the chat. The link to my LinkedIn is the first link that is on the resource guide that I gave to you all. And I'm going to be quiet while you all ask me those questions or type the word stack in the chat so that I can answer any questions that you all have or hear any reflections that you all have on that in which we engage today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you all so much for the invitation. And it would be an honor of mine if you have other things or ways to continue this conversation or other challenges that your institutions might be facing, for you all to reach out to me and include me as a thought partner in tackling some of those tough challenges. I appreciate it. Y'all have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Edney. That was great. I know I gleaned a lot from that conversation. But while you're putting that in the chat, I'm actually, we have like about 5 minutes left. So if people do want to engage, have something to say, have something to share, more than welcome to do so. We also can have some wiggle room, so we can stay until 1 if people want to like keep the discussion going, they have things to say. If you can't, that's perfectly fine. You can drop off. So thank you, Dr. Edney, for putting that in the chat. I'm also going to put the link to the evaluation for today in the chat, as well as the link to our LinkedIn page, so to make it easier for you to be able to access.
All right, questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, examples or case studies that you'd like for me to riff on. I'd be happy to.
I have a question and just a comment in general. First of all, this is one of my most favorite areas to discuss because I work at a veterinary school and please don't take me as an ageist, anybody on here. I just noticed that my more seasoned coworkers are not interested in this at all. They see this as a soft subject and of no consequence to our students' development. And I'm so at a disagreement because I'm working with mostly Gen Z students, some millennials, and they feel unheard. They feel like there's no one, and if they were not in class, they would be living in my office because they have told me that they see me as a safe space, and it's something that I really treasure. But how do you bring the conversation to coworkers that this is so critical to their academic experience? They are about to enter the world and work with others, and they are not comfortable with having these sensitive conversations because everyone's often offended and those things. I think this is so critical for their development, and we are responsible for not just their academic training, but also these areas. So what is your thought for that? Besides telling them to come to your, having you come speak at our college. I mean, which I think that's something that would definitely we need. But what else can you recommend for that?
Yeah, so what I just shared with you is a presentation that you can think of as very aspirational, right? That in order to achieve the things that I've put into this presentation, there need to be some strategic planning and some consistency around how we build these things. But I'll tell you kind of high level how I think about shifting environments and helping to create that. I start with the top. I'm usually asked by a president or a vice president to come in and hear the challenges that as a college is having, And then I ask, okay, well, what already exists? What are you already doing to prepare faculty and staff to make sure that so are there faculty, are they regularly, meeting? Are you regularly meeting with your senior leadership team? How can we make subtle adjustments to those meetings? So if you're already doing professional development in those spaces, then let's weave these types of topics and these types of preparations into our professional development. Maybe this is the topic of a retreat that we're having that's coming up, right? So to the extent that I can, I try to introduce it into what already exists. If people are already having performance evaluations, then I create some type of metrics within there, right? That speaks to the importance of someone's commitment to engaging in these types of topics. What already exists? What opportunities are there for us to set as a critical expectation that this is how we'll engage? But it's also, measuring where you are, recognizing where you are. So you don't go straight to, introducing a senior leadership team and let's come up with these, community agreements. You might start with a climate study. You might start with a study where people can answer questions like rate the extent to which my opinions are valued in this space, right? Rate the extent to which my contributions are celebrated, or I rate the extent to which I agree with the following. My contributions are celebrated commensurate with those of other departments, or that I am given, that I am delegated authority and not just task. Whatever is important to your organization, you can start there. What we did at the University of Mississippi, I found myself a student constantly showing up to town halls and things like that after something racially challenging had happened at the University of Mississippi, and hearing the same thing over and over, the institution distancing itself from what occurred. And what I found missing was, why haven't we had the discussion about what is it about this institution that makes people feel comfortable coming here to do that? And it was that question that got me invited into the office with the vice president of student affairs. It's what led to me getting a master's in higher education. They asked me while I was getting that master's to prove to the chancellor, not to say that he was, resistant or anything, but to demonstrate academically that the University of Mississippi could benefit from a multicultural center. So we trained a group of students on how to do focus groups, on how to analyze data, on what questions they should ask. Those students went out and did the climate study, they did the focus groups, they did the benchmarking of other institutions. They put all those things together in a report, and it's hard to argue when you've got something there saying our students don't feel X. We have this mission to provide Y student experience, right? But we've got the data showing you right here that students feel W and S and T. So how are we going to get X, right? If we've set our mind toward it. So it really depends on where you are. You need the willingness of leadership, but starting where you are and starting to infiltrate those things that already exist is a good starting point. I'd be happy to talk about what some of those others are, but without knowing the specifics of what you all are ready for, what you all have tried, and what some of the sticking points are, I hope that that's a good overview answer to your question.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. Y'all don't let my wordiness scare you out of asking other questions. I promise I'll try not to be as comprehensive to the next question.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Just based off your background, so from you working at University of Mississippi and then now at Talladega, what distinctions or differences do you see with their administration and their willingness to have these conversations?
So one of the reasons that I chose Crucial Conversations as a framework is because it's universal, right? There are challenging conversations that I have to measure the way I'm going to show up at Talladega that are very different than the conversations that I had to think about how I showed up at the University of Mississippi. But what is shared is that those nuances of how you show up are still based in people and their positionality and their connection to their orientation to the mission of the institution, the context, right, that they've been exposed to or that they value. So remember, I started with that question of who am I? right? What is my goal? What is my capacity to be able to, right? And so my goal ultimately is to influence education at the highest levels and create as many opportunities for as many students as I can. And I filter the way that I show up in all of the conversations and tough conversations pursuant to that goal in the context of Talladega. So what does that mean? That might mean here that I have to challenge the existence or lack of systems that may or may not be in the way of us progress, meeting our goals. Well, I had to do that at the University of Mississippi too, right? The challenge at the University of Mississippi wasn't a lack of resources. It was that those resources were diffuse. Here, it may be that I've got to, and at the University of Mississippi, knowing that those resources were diffuse, how did I fix it? I went and got resources on my own to prove that we needed them for the things that I found interesting. I didn't, I might not win the game of getting the institution to distribute the resources to these things, but I can convince AT&T. I can convince, right? In fact, they're already convinced. So how can I connect our mutual interests in that respect? Well, I have to do that at Talladega too. It might be less institutionally for me to start with, right? But I still have to figure out how to have these tough conversations in order for us to, meet the challenges that we have and be able to transition them. The people dynamics are different. The assumptions that people make are different. So I'm much less conscious of, at the University of Mississippi, I was very conscious of being a young Black man every time I entered into spaces. Here, I'm very conscious of being a young, light-skinned Black man who came from a predominantly white institution, right? Whose only reference point in the perspectives that I've ever, or at least from the perspective of those who engage with me, it would be very easy for them to assume that my perspective is only informed by that context, right? So I necessarily or understand that I've got to earn, or at least my perception is that what I carry with me is that I'm going to have to earn, right? The trust within this space, that I'm here too to serve the students and that we can reach some consensus about how we do it. So those are just some reflections on what the transition's been like and why I think these conversations are important for us no matter what context we find ourselves in. Thank you for the affirmation there. Appreciate it in the chat. Well, I know there was a long pause before that one, and anytime the presenters are filling the gap with questions, you got to take your hints. I'll take my hint that I've been comprehensive and thorough, and that I provided resources that you all feel like you can go back and reference if you have other questions. But it's also my hope that I made some additional friends, that we are all leaving smarter together. I know I've achieved one of my goals every time I speak to folks, that I leave here smarter. But in order for us to stay connected, I've also offered my LinkedIn profile again. It's the first link on that resource document that I gave to you all. You got the resources in the chat too. They are linked in the PowerPoint, which is also one of the first links that's in that folder. So I've tried to build in some redundancies because I think this is extremely important and want to model you all the type of partner that I could be in helping to solve other problems at your institution. So thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it.